Chapter 1: Wine and the First Rupture. Quiet drinking. Before Europe, before the surgery, I was drinking quietly. Not recklessly. Quietly. From the outside, my life looked stable enough. Husband, father, and businessman working mostly in tiling and waterproofing in the construction industry, running between sites, suppliers, invoices, and the kids' routines. Childcare drop-offs, our eldest's first year of preschool, the usual logistics of a young family. I dealt with clients and subcontractors, organized jobs, handled paperwork and money. Nothing in the day-to-day looked like a collapse. From the inside, my nervous system was rarely at rest. There was a constant low-level static, a tight chest, racing thoughts at night, a sense that I was always half a step behind what life was asking from me. By 2022, I was drinking every workday. On most of those days, I would finish a bottle of red before I got home, usually sometime between 4 and 6 in the afternoon, drinking in the car or between jobs, so that I walked through the front door already primed, already a bit unsteady. Our home by then was a newly built duplex on a block my mother had bought from the Department of Housing with the help of her wealthy partner. Emily and I had designed the upstairs ensuite off our bedroom ourselves as a family bathroom, a wet area style room with a glass shower screen, a shower rose, and a bathtub directly beside it so that the whole space could be used at once. Every night at home followed the same pattern. My wife, Emily, and I would feed the kids around 7, then take them upstairs to that ensuite. We would bathe the kids in the tub, dry them off, dress them in our bedroom, and then take them to their rooms to read stories and put them to bed. Sometimes Emily and I would shower while the kids were in the bath, all 4 of us in the same steamy room. On better nights, I joined in fully with that. Bath, towels, pajamas, books. As 2022 went on, those better nights became less common. More often, I would stay downstairs doing the dishes, while Emily handled the bath and bedtime, and while I was at the sink, I would pour myself another 2 to 6 glasses of wine.
I didn't think of myself as an alcoholic. In my head, that word belonged to people who woke up in gutters and couldn't function at all. I was still working. I was still providing. The cost was hidden inside my body, not on my public record. Looking back now, with words like bipolar, trauma, and nervous system regulation that I didn't have at the time, I can see that alcohol wasn't a luxury or a treat. It was a tool. It led me to avoid feeling how overloaded I was. It regulated my emotions. By the end of 2022, what looked from the outside like normal adult life was already a form of self-medication. Europe. Drinking instead of being there. In May 2022, I flew to Europe with my wife, who was pregnant with our 3rd child, and our 2 children. On paper, it was the family trip you are supposed to feel grateful for. Long-haul flights, cousins to see, and new cities for the kids. We started at an all-inclusive family resort in Mallorca, part of the Viva Hotels and Resorts chain, and stayed there for about 5 days. The whole point of those places is that parents can finally drop their shoulders for a week while the kids live in pools and playgrounds. What I had not properly considered was that all-inclusive meant alcohol on tap from morning until late at night. My days fell into a routine, a session at the gym to prove to myself I was being healthy, then straight into the complimentary drinks, taking work calls between refills so I could pretend I was still being responsible. There were whole stretches where I left my wife and kids at the pool or the playground and disappeared for hours. I would tell myself I was just going to grab a drink and then drift further away from them, find a corner of a bar, scroll my phone, drink until the internal static softened, and only then plug myself back into the family. The gym sessions and work calls became part of the cover story I used to excuse how much I was drinking and how often I was stepping away. I did not have language yet for what was happening. I only knew that my anxiety was spiking for no obvious reason, that my thoughts were racing at night, that being on as a dad in a foreign country felt like too much, and that alcohol was the only thing that made the world feel briefly flat again.
From Spain, we flew to England, to Broadstairs on the Kent coast, to visit Emily's brother Liam and his partner, Sivan, so our kids could spend time with their cousins, including one born around the same time as our eldest. That part of the trip should have been easy.
Familiar faces, cousins playing together, a seaside town. Instead, the same pattern followed us and then sharpened. We rented a 3-bedroom Airbnb house in Broadstairs from 10 to 22 May 2022, a short walk up from the beach and pier. Inside, it had timber floors, band posters on the walls, a bright kitchen with a bay window, and brown sofas around a fireplace in the living room. It should have been the perfect base for a small family holiday. Some evenings, I would drive laps around Broadstairs in the hire car, circling the town past the supermarkets and bottle shops until the internal pressure dropped, and only then going back to the house. My story to myself was simple. I just needed to take the edge off before I could be present. What I feel now when I think about Broadstairs is not just guilt, but absence. I was physically there in photos, standing next to people I loved and holding my son's hand on a pier, but emotionally I was circulating elsewhere. I was there and not there, ducking out of scenes that should have been simple and joyful to sit with. Jet lag for most people is an annoyance. For me, with a brain already running hot, it was a destabilizer. The time zone shifts, broken sleep, and constant low-grade anxiety opened cracks in the wall between functional and falling apart. On that trip, alcohol became the only tool I knew to patch that wall as it cracked. The black eye. There is one night in Broadstairs that sits in my memory like a dark vignette. On our last night in town, we went to Liam and Sivan's for dinner. It was warm and familiar. The kids drifted between screens and play, while the adults sat around the table, and drinks flowed in that casual way that can turn into something else if you are not paying attention. By the time we left, I was a few drinks in and acutely ill at ease, a familiar combination by then. I drove my family back to the Airbnb, told my wife I was going back out for a bit, and she did not argue. She knew something was wrong, but it was hard to name. She absorbed it. She let me go. I walked down to the high street and went from pub to pub alone. I have flashes, a bar counter, a jukebox light, the feeling of my body leaning into the pleasant buzz as it tipped into something blurrier. Then nothing. I woke the next morning on a couch in the Airbnb. It was the day we were meant to be packing up and taking the kids on a train to Paris. When I looked in the mirror, there was a black eye staring back at me. I do not know exactly how it happened. My best guess now is that at some point that night, I found a way to be punished that matched how I felt inside. I do not have a neat story about a fight or a fall. What I have is the result, a bruise that made the outside of my face look as battered as the inside of my chest. What I know is this: I woke up with a black eye in Broadstairs. My pregnant wife and our small children were waiting to board a train to another country with me. I had no clear account of how I had earned the bruise. We went to Paris. It was miserable. I was not romantic or attentive. I was hungover, ashamed, more irritable, and more dependent on alcohol than when we left Australia. The trip that should have refilled the tank did the opposite. It stripped away whatever spare resilience I had left. The night my appendix burst. Back in Sydney, the routines resumed. Parenting roles, work calls, project problems, and family logistics. The jet lag faded. The way I was using alcohol did not. If anything, the pattern tightened. Wine was there every night, often more than I admitted to myself. My sleep was shallow and broken. I carried a constant sense of being slightly behind on everything. On paper, the pressures were normal. I had busy jobs, young kids, and family dynamics that were complicated but not catastrophic. Emotionally, they were already heavy. Physically, I ignored signs that my body was under strain, the heaviness in my gut, the sluggishness in the mornings, and the waves of fatigue I wrote off as just being busy. I did not see myself as the kind of person whose internal organs could fail. When the collapse came, it came fast. A few months after we got back from Europe, barely enough time for the trip to settle into memory, I developed a pain in my abdomen that did not behave like the usual stomach upset. It started as a dull ache and then sharpened. It moved and stretched in a way that made it hard to find a position that did not hurt. I told myself it was probably something I had eaten, or a bug, or muscular strain.
My threshold for seeking help was high. I saw myself as tough and good with pain. Admitting I needed emergency care felt like weakness. By the time I presented to hospital, I was already more unwell than I understood. The appendix had not just inflamed, it had ruptured. Infection was seeping through my abdominal cavity. The beginnings of septic shock were there in the blood tests and the surgeon's notes. On the outside, I was just another man doubled over on a gurney. On the inside, my body was tipping into failure. The surgeons took me to theater. The operative report, when I later requested and read it, does not flinch. It describes a necrotic appendix, purulent fluid throughout the abdomen, the need to wash and suction and clear infection, and the steps taken to keep me alive. At the time, I experienced it only in fragments: the sting of the cannula, the anesthetic mask, a ceiling light in the corridor, waking up with tubes and lines, and voices around the bed saying that they had gotten it in time. I knew something bad had happened, but I did not have the bandwidth to take in how close it had come. After surgery, I was kept in hospital for 3 days. Medically, that was standard. I needed intravenous antibiotics, pain control, monitoring, and time for my gut to restart. From my point of view, it felt like imprisonment. I pushed hard against the idea that I needed to stay. The same pride that had kept me away from the emergency department until the last minute turned into arguments about discharge. In my mind, a man who could not leave hospital when he wanted to was a man who had failed a basic test of toughness. At the time, I framed it as work ethic and responsibility, needing to get back to jobs, clients, and family. Now I can see it more clearly as an inability to tolerate stillness. Rest meant feeling. Feeling meant facing the way I had been living. Movement was safer. Doing was safer.
One detail in the hospital records cuts more deeply than the surgical description. Alongside the infection markers, the blood tests comment on my liver enzymes. In the notes, it is almost throwaway, routine data, a line or two that a doctor would read and move on from. To me, reading it later, it was a retroactive verdict on the years of quiet drinking. The numbers were not dramatic enough to turn the notes into an addiction case study. They were not screaming cirrhosis, but they were high enough to say, to anyone who knew how to read them, that my body was working overtime to cope. In hindsight, I can link the strands: the Broadstairs black eye, the solo drinking in an all-inclusive resort, the evenings in Sydney with just a few wines, and the enzyme levels flagged in a printout after surgery. The burst appendix was not caused by alcohol. That would be inaccurate and dishonest. But by the time that physical crisis came, I had very little spare capacity to handle it. My system was already strained. The rupture found a body that had been pushed too hard for too long. Recovery, gratitude, and denial. The immediate post-operative period looked like any other on the surface. Friends and family messaged. People said the expected lines, that I was lucky they had caught it in time and that I had to take it easy now. The tone around me was relief. Doctors gave standard advice about rest, follow-up appointments, and looking after myself. I nodded in the right places and concentrated on getting out of there and back to normal life. Normal life, for me, meant getting back on the phone, getting back behind the wheel, proving to myself I was still strong and capable, and slowly but steadily sliding back into the same patterns that had been there before. For a short period, the shock of surgery did curb the worst excesses. There were evenings where I drank less and told myself I was looking after my liver now. I told myself this had been a wake-up call. But a wake-up call is only useful if you change course after answering it. I did not. I pressed snooze. As the surgical scars knitted and the memory of the hospital faded into anecdote, I slipped back into the old routines. The way I worked, the way I drank, and the way I carried tension in my chest did not fundamentally change. If anything, by the end of 2022, the pattern had hardened. What had once been a few glasses of wine at night was turning into bottles of vodka drunk straight, alone, late, long after everyone else had gone to bed. If anything, the brush with sepsis gave me a new way to ignore it all: gratitude. I told myself I should be grateful just to be alive, and I was. But instead of letting that gratitude push me toward change, I used it as a shield. Whenever a thought about my drinking or my mental health nudged at me, I could swat it away by reminding myself that it could have been so much worse. Gratitude became another refuge, a way to avoid asking harder questions. The year after surgery, 2023, deserves its own close examination later in this book. It sits between this first physical collapse and the full manic episode of 2024. For the purposes of this chapter, it is enough to say that I went back to work with an even stronger determination to push through, that alcohol remained in the background as my main way of dampening fear and agitation, and that the unresolved psychological and family dynamics that had been there for years continued largely unchanged. My mind had already begun to fracture in 2022. I just did not have the insight or the diagnosis to name it yet. I decided to cease drinking alcohol in October that year, not realizing that that would start the long ignition to the burst later on. By the time 2024 arrived, nothing that happened came out of nowhere. The burst appendix, the 3-day hospital stay I tried to argue my way out of, the blood tests, the shift from wine to straight vodka, and the photo roll full of jobs instead of faces were not isolated incidents. They were early warning lights on a dashboard I did not know how to read. This chapter is not about blame or neat causality. It is about the load on a nervous system that could not hold indefinitely, and the ways I tried to build refuge out of work, wine, toughness, and gratitude, long after both body and mind had started to give way.